The cold arrived before dawn that Saturday, settling over the fairgrounds like a held breath. Snow had fallen through the night, not the heavy, suffocating kind, but the quiet, deliberate kind that muffles sound and makes the world feel suspended between one moment and the next. By the time the gates opened at 8 in the morning, a thin white crust covered the gravel lot, the temporary fencing, the folding chairs lined up in crooked rows, and every flat surface of every automobile that had been hauled in and positioned the evening before. The annual Midwest Classic Car Invitational was, by any honest measure, the most prestigious outdoor auction of its kind between the Rockies and the Appalachians. A gathering that drew collectors, dealers, restorers, and spectators from across 20 states, and sometimes farther. Tents had been erected along the perimeter, their canvas walls stamped with the logos of insurance companies and private wealth management firms, because the people who attended this auction were the kind of people whose hobbies required insurance and whose money required management. Ferrari was represented. Shelby was represented. A stunning, numbers-matching 1969 Camaro Z, 28 inches fathom green, sat beneath a spotlight that someone had set up the night before. And that spotlight, improbably, still burned through the morning haze, casting a small green cathedral of light in the gray air. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Gerald, with a voice like gravel in a tin can, was testing his microphone near the main stage. Catering staff in black vests moved between the tents, carrying trays of coffee and small plates of pastry. Everything was exactly as it always was. And then it wasn't. Nobody noticed the Corvette at first. That was the thing people would talk about afterward, not the car itself, at least not initially, but the way it arrived without announcement, without fanfare, without the kind of theatrical staging that the other consigners had arranged for their vehicles. It came in through the service entrance at the east end of the fairgrounds, driven by a man who parked it himself, climbed out without assistance, and stood beside it for a moment, in the snow with his hands in the pockets of a canvas work jacket, the color of old moss. The jacket was not new, neither were the boots. Neither, it appeared, was anything else about him, and not in the deliberately cultivated way of a man who wears old things to signal that he has transcended the need to impress, but in the simpler, more honest way of a man who simply wears what he has. His name was Jack Walker. He was somewhere on the north side of 55, with a face that had been weathered by decades of physical work and the specific quietness of a man who had spent a long time living mostly alone. His hair had gone the color of iron. He had broad hands and patient eyes, and the kind of posture that comes not from military training but from years of leaning over an engine block in a garage that probably never got warm enough in winter. He had registered for the auction 3 weeks earlier, driving to the county office himself to fill out the paperwork. And when the intake coordinator had asked him what vehicle he was consigning, he had written, in careful block letters, 1,963 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray, split-window coupe. The coordinator had glanced up at him over her reading glasses. He had not elaborated. The car was not beautiful in the way that the other cars at the auction were beautiful. That needs to be said plainly, because the story that followed cannot be understood without first understanding what the car looked like, standing there in the snow. It was not polished. It was not restored to the kind of factory specification perfection that auction cars typically require, the paint corrected to a mirror finish, the chrome replated, the interior restitched in period-correct leather, every surface carrying the artificial youth of a thing that has been made to pretend it was never old. The Corvette was Riverside red, or had been once. Now the paint held the honest patina of 6 decades of atmosphere, a certain depth of color that restoration would have destroyed, a warmth that no spray booth could replicate. There were small chips along the leading edge of the hood, where decades of highway travel had left their mark. The chrome was intact, but not brilliant. The interior was original, the seats cracked in 2 places along the bolster, the carpet slightly faded, the steering wheel worn smooth in the places where hands had gripped it 10,000 times. And there, at the lower left corner of the front passenger side headlight housing, was a small crescent-shaped scratch, perhaps 2 inches long, shallow and old, the kind of mark that had been there so long it had become part of the car's identity rather than a flaw in it. A few of the nearby dealers glanced at it and glanced away. One man in a cashmere overcoat said something to his associate that made both of them smile. None of them were looking at the car the way it deserved to be looked at. Which is to say, none of them were looking at it as a thing that had a history. Victoria Sinclair arrived at 9:45 in a black Escalade that idled for a moment at the VIP entrance before the door opened, and she stepped out into the cold with the particular self-possession of someone who has learnt to enter rooms and, by extension, spaces of all kinds in a way that leaves no doubt about who is arriving. She was 41 years old and had been on the cover of 3 national business publications in the past 2 years. Her company, Sinclair Technologies, had grown from a regional software firm to a global infrastructure platform valued at somewhere north of $4 billion, a fact that various profiles described with barely concealed amazement, as though the number were somehow improbable, given that the person responsible for it was a woman who had started with nothing. She wore a charcoal wool coat, no jewelry except for a single watch on her left wrist that was expensive enough to be quiet about it, and she carried no bag. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her expression, as she walked through the gate and accepted a program from the volunteer stationed there, was one of focused neutrality, the face of someone moving through the world with a specific purpose that they have not yet chosen to share. The people near the entrance noticed her. They always noticed her. A whisper moved through the nearest cluster of dealers and collectors like a small current of electricity. Victoria Sinclair was here. The consensus formed almost instantly. She was here for the Shelby, or possibly the pre-war Packard that a deceased industrialist's estate had finally released. She had the resources for either. She had the resources for all of it, if she wanted. She walked past the Shelby without slowing. She walked past the Packard, past the Camaro still glowing under its misplaced spotlight, past a stunning Jaguar E-Type in British racing green that caused 2 collectors nearby to physically turn and watch her ignore it. She moved through the rows with the deliberate unhurriedness of someone following a frequency only she could hear. And the people who watched her began to feel a faint unease, the way you feel when a story is not going in the direction you expected. And then she stopped. She stopped in front of the Corvette, and for a moment she simply stood there in the snow, very still, with the program she had been given held loosely at her side, and her eyes moving over the car with an expression that was difficult to read from a distance, something between recognition and grief, between the satisfaction of having found a thing and the sorrow of understanding what finding it means. Jack was standing a few feet away, drinking coffee from a paper cup, watching her with the measured patience of a man who has learned not to rush other people's processes. He did not speak. She circled the car slowly, unhurried, her eyes cataloging details that a casual observer would have dismissed as imperfections. The precise placement of the paint chips, the particular way the chrome had aged, the condition of the original side exhaust pipes, the almost imperceptible way the driver's door hung just a fraction of a millimeter lower than factory. The result of something that had happened once, decades ago, and had been adjusted but never perfectly corrected. She crouched beside the left front wheel well and looked at something for a long moment. Then she stood, and she turned to Jack, and she asked, "How long have you owned it?" Her voice was controlled, but the control itself was conspicuous, the voice of someone managing something that wanted very much to be louder. Jack considered the question as though it deserved consideration. He said he had owned it for going on 30 years, give or take. She nodded slowly, as though the answer confirmed something rather than providing new information. She asked where he had driven it. He said mostly not far out to the county roads in spring, sometimes down toward the river when the weather was good, a longer trip once or twice a year to keep everything moving the way it should. She asked if it had ever been restored. He said no. She asked if he had ever had the paint done. He said no. She asked about the scratch near the headlight, and when she asked it, something shifted in her face, a micro-expression, there and gone, like a word spoken under breath that the speaker immediately decides not to repeat aloud. Jack looked at her steadily. He said the scratch had been there when the car came to him, and he had left it where it was. She said, quietly, and almost to herself, Yes, it would have been. A few collectors who had drifted closer in the past few minutes exchanged glances. The murmur in the surrounding space had changed frequency. Something was happening here that they did not yet understand. And the not understanding made them attentive in a different way than money usually made them attentive. Gerald, the auctioneer, had noticed the clustering of bodies around the unglamorous Corvette and was making his way over with the professional alertness of a man whose income depends on sensing where interest has pooled. One of the private dealers, a man named Patterson, who had been in the business for 30 years and had a particular talent for identifying a transaction before it fully formed, materialized at Jack's elbow and opened with the figure of $150,000, offered in the smooth and practiced way of someone who has made opening offers so many times that the words have lost all weight. Jack looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has heard a number that does not correspond to the thing being discussed, and he said, evenly, that he had not actually decided whether he was selling. Patterson recalibrated. Gerald arrived. Victoria was still looking at the car. And then she turned fully toward Jack, and in a voice that carried without being raised, that landed in the ears of everyone within 20 feet with the clarity of something that has been waiting a long time to be said, she offered $500,000. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock, but the silence of recalibration, the moment when a room full of people simultaneously revises its model of what is happening. Patterson stepped back half a pace. Gerald's professional composure flickered. Two men with phones pulled them out, not to call anyone, but in the instinctive reaching for documentation that humans perform when they sense they are witnessing something they will later want to describe. Jack looked at Victoria for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, and without apology, no. The silence recalibrated again. Someone in the crowd made a sound that was almost a laugh, the involuntary vocalization of a person whose brain has misfired because the input does not match any stored pattern. Victoria did not blink. She did not reconsider. She looked at Jack with an expression that had shed the controlled neutrality of earlier, and was now something else, something closer to the surface. And she said, $1 million. Just that. No further qualification, no framing, no negotiation posture. $1 million for a car that a dozen experts in the surrounding radius would have appraised at a fraction of that number. The crowd went still in the particular way that crowds go still when something has exceeded the scale their expectations had prepared for. Phones came out in earnest now. Murmurs swelled and subsided. Gerald stood with his clipboard pressed to his chest and said nothing. Everyone was looking at Jack Walker in his old canvas jacket, holding his paper cup of coffee that had by now gone cold, and waiting. He was quiet for what felt much longer than it was. In that quiet, a complicated sequence of events was not occurring. He was not calculating, not weighing, not running numbers against each other in the way that the watching crowd assumed a person must be running numbers when $1 million is on the table. What he was doing was simpler and more difficult than calculation. He was remembering. The memory came the way memories come when they have been stored carefully for a long time, not in pieces but whole. Arriving with the smell and temperature of the original moment intact, the way a letter kept in a drawer will carry the faint scent of the room where it was written. He said, finally, that he appreciated the offer. He said he appreciated it sincerely. And then he said, with the same quietness he had brought to every exchange in this conversation, that he didn't think he could sell it. Not for that. Not for anything. The crowd reacted, not uniformly, but in the fractured way of a group that has not agreed on what it is witnessing. Some faces registering disbelief, some admiration, some the specific disdain of people who have decided that the refusal must be a negotiating tactic because the alternative, that a man simply meant what he said, is too disorienting to accept. Someone near the back called out that Jack was crazy. Someone else laughed. A dealer in a fleece vest made a quiet comment to the man beside him about the performance value of playing hard to get, and then Victoria spoke again, and what she asked was not what anyone expected. She looked at Jack with an expression that had gone very still, the way water goes still before something surfaces, and she asked, Who gave it to you? The question landed differently than anything else that had been said in the previous 20 minutes. It was not a buyer's question. It was not a negotiator's question. It was the question of someone who already suspects the answer and is asking because the asking itself is necessary, because some knowledge needs to be arrived at through speech rather than through silence, even when the knowledge is already there. Jack looked at her. The crowd, which had been operating on the assumption that it was watching a transaction, began to sense that it was watching something else entirely. Jack set down his coffee cup on the hood of the nearest vehicle, not his own, someone else's, a gesture of unconscious informality that in another context might have caused offense, and he said that it was a long story. Victoria said she had time, and the cold air of the Saturday morning fairgrounds settled into the kind of stillness that precedes a story that needs to be told, the way weather settles before something changes. 30 years ago, give or take a season, Jack Walker was 25 years old and working as a mechanic at a small independent garage outside of Columbus, the kind of place that has a hand-painted sign and a gravel apron, and keeps itself alive by doing the work that the dealerships overcharge for. He was good at the work and he knew it, but knowing it did not translate, at 25, into the kind of financial stability that makes a man feel that the world is an orderly place. He was renting a room from an older woman who kept the heat at 62 degrees in winter to save on the gas bill. He drove a truck that he was, at the time, in the middle of an argument with. He ate from a hot plate and sent the rest of his money home to his mother in Dayton and did not, in that period, think very much about the future, which had not yet revealed itself to be something worth the effort of imagining. It was December the 19th. He remembered it specifically because the garage had put up a small artificial tree near the register. The kind with the multicolored lights that made the whole thing look more festive and slightly more forlorn at the same time. He was driving home along Route 22 at 11 at night when his headlights found a car pulled onto the shoulder with its hazard lights running, and beside it, a man standing in the snow with his hands in his pockets, looking at the engine with the specific helplessness of someone who understands enough about engines to know that looking at one will not fix it. Jack pulled over. This was not a complicated decision. It was the kind of decision that 25-year-old Jack Walker made automatically, the way people make decisions that are aligned with who they are before the world has had enough time to teach them to second-guess themselves. The man was older mid-60s, Jack estimated, though he would later revise that upward. He was well-dressed in a way that suggested he had come from somewhere formal, and he had the kind of face that looked as though it had once been decisive, and was now in the process of arriving at something past decisiveness, something quieter and more considered. His name, he said, was Robert. He did not offer a last name, and Jack did not ask for one, because that is how things worked on the shoulder of Route 22 at 11 o'clock on a winter night, between strangers who both understood that the important thing was the car and not the biography. Jack looked at the engine. The problem was a cracked distributor cap, not catastrophic, but not fixable without parts. And parts were not available on Route 22 at 11 at night. He drove Robert to the nearest open gas station, sourced a replacement from the shelf of odds and ends that such stations keep for exactly these situations, drove back, and had the car running in 40 minutes. Robert stood in the snow beside him the entire time, handing him things when asked, holding the flashlight without being told to hold it steadier, saying nothing that was unnecessary. When the engine turned over, Robert exhaled in a way that was about more than the car. He tried to pay Jack. Jack said no. This was also automatic. Robert looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that a person gives when they are deciding how to say something they have not yet found the words for, and then he said that Jack was a good man, and that good men were rarer than they appeared, and that he did not intend to forget this. Jack said something non-committal in return, the way young men do when older men say things that are too earnest for the register of the moment, and drove home. But Robert meant what he said. He found Jack 2 weeks later through the garage where he worked. He had noted the name and called the number, and he showed up one afternoon in January with 2 cups of coffee and a willingness to talk that Jack did not know what to do with at first. Robert had been a businessman, he explained, in the way that people use that word to encompass decades of complexity they do not want to specify. He had been successful and then not successful and then successful again. And somewhere in the course of all that he had learned things that he thought were worth passing on, and he had been looking, without quite knowing he was looking, for someone to pass them to. He had a daughter, he mentioned once, just once, in passing, in the way people mention things that are simultaneously central and too painful to approach directly. She was brilliant, he said. She would do remarkable things. He seemed, saying it, to be both proud and sorrowful in the same breath, the way parents are sometimes proud and sorrowful about the children they love most. He did not elaborate on why he was not with her, or with anyone. And Jack did not ask. Because Jack had learned early that some information is offered when a person is ready, and not before. They met for coffee through that winter, and into the spring, and what developed between them was not exactly mentorship, and not exactly friendship, but something with elements of both a relationship built on the specific chemistry of a younger man who was genuinely willing to listen and an older man who had genuinely important things to say and had been waiting a long time for someone to say them to. Robert talked about work and integrity and the specific price of certain compromises. He talked about what it meant to keep a promise in a world that increasingly treated promises as provisional. He talked about the difference between the value of a thing and the price of a thing, and about how the confusion between the two was the source of most of the specific unhappiness he had witnessed in his life. Jack listened. He was a young man with a hot plate and a cold room and a truck he was fighting with, and he was being told, by a man who had been through something and come out the other side of it, that the things he had always instinctively believed were actually true. This was not a small thing. The years moved in the way that years move when you are not watching them carefully. Jack stayed in Columbus, eventually started his own shop, eventually married a woman named Marie, who laughed at his jokes even when they were not very good, and loved him steadily and without drama until she died, 12 years in, from something quick and terrible that the doctors named with a long word that did not make it more comprehensible. He raised their daughter, Emma, alone after that, raised her the way he did everything, which was carefully and without complaint, and with the particular tenderness of a man who has learned that tenderness is not weakness, but is, in fact, the hardest thing there is. Robert had been present for some of this, at a distance, sending letters and calling on holidays, and appearing in person once or twice a year, in the way of someone who has made a commitment to a friendship, and intends to honor it regardless of the inconvenience. And then, gradually, Robert's health had begun to do what health eventually does, and the visits had become less frequent, and the calls shorter, and the letters. Robert still wrote letters, actual letters, in a handwriting that looked as though it had been trained by nuns, had taken on the particular quality of letters written by someone who is making sure certain things are said before the opportunity to say them passes. And one spring morning, 12 years after that night on Route 22, Jack had received a call from a lawyer in a city he had never visited, informing him that a man named Robert had died peacefully the previous week and had left Jack Walker, of Columbus, Ohio, one item, a 1963 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray, split-window coupe, in Riverside Red, currently stored at a facility whose address the lawyer provided. And with it, a letter. The letter was sealed in an envelope on which Robert had written, in his careful, nun-trained hand, "For the person who appears at the right time." Jack had understood this to mean him. He had driven to retrieve the car, paid the storage fees himself, and brought it home to his garage, where he had looked at it for a long time before opening the hood and confirming, without real surprise, that it was in beautiful mechanical condition. Robert had maintained it meticulously. Because Robert maintained everything meticulously. Because Robert was exactly the kind of man who maintained things meticulously. Jack had not opened the letter. He had read the outside of the envelope again, "For the person who appears at the right time," and he had understood, in the way that people sometimes understand things they cannot yet articulate, that this phrase was not describing him. Not yet. Not necessarily. He had placed the envelope in the small locking compartment beneath the driver's seat a feature of that particular Corvette that most people did not know was there, and he had kept it there for 30 years. He had driven the car gently and maintained it with everything Robert had taught him about what maintenance means when you care about a thing. And he had waited, in the unhurried way of a man who trusts that some things resolve in their own time, for the person the envelope was actually addressed to. Victoria had gone very still while Jack was speaking. The crowd around them had also gone still, but in a different way, the stillness of people held by a story, which is a kind of voluntary stillness, a suspension of private concerns in the face of something larger. Victoria's stillness was not voluntary. It was the stillness of someone in the grip of a realization so large that the body does not yet know how to move inside it. The color had not left her face but had changed in quality, the way light changes when clouds move. She had a particular way, Jack would notice later, of holding very still when something was almost too much, not withdrawing, not shutting down, but becoming motionless in the way of someone gathering all available resources toward a single point of processing. When she spoke, her voice was the same controlled voice as before, but the control now cost more. She asked him the name of the man. Jack told her. The full name, Robert Allen Sinclair, and Victoria closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, which was the time it took for 30 years of unanswered questions to arrange themselves into something that resembled, if not an answer, then at least a shape. When she opened her eyes, they were bright, and she made no effort to manage what was in them. And the crowd, which had prepared itself for many kinds of afternoons, had not prepared itself for this one. Robert Allen Sinclair had been, for the first 11 years of Victoria's life, the kind of father who made the world feel stable, not through displays of warmth, because Robert's warmth was quiet and structural rather than demonstrative, but through presence and reliability and the specific safety of a man who means every word he says. He had run a mid-sized manufacturing company in Indiana, the kind of company that made components rather than products, the invisible infrastructure of other people's visible things, and he had run it with the same meticulous integrity with which he maintained everything else. The year Victoria turned 11, the company had faced a crisis that she had not, at 11, fully understood: a creditor crisis, a cascade of events, the specific financial anatomy of which she had only reconstructed much later from documents and conversations, and the forensic patience of someone who needed to understand how a thing had happened. What she had understood at 11 was simpler and more devastating. One morning, her father had been there, and then, in the weeks that followed, he had been less there, and then not there at all. And her mother had explained his absence in the language that adults use to explain things to children when the truth is too complicated. Which is to say, she had explained it inadequately. Victoria had grown up with the missing shape of her father, occupying a specific negative space in her interior landscape, not the grief of confirmed loss, which has at least the dignity of closure, but the more corrosive uncertainty of abandonment without explanation, which allows the imagination to construct and reconstruct its own narratives, none of them adequate, all of them painful. She had turned that corrosive uncertainty, as some people turn their damage, into an extraordinary engine. She had built things first, small things, then larger things, then things so large that their size became a form of notation, a way of writing something in the world that could not be said in words. She had never stopped looking for the explanation, the way people who grow up with unanswered questions carry those questions into every room they enter, not always consciously, not always loudly, but always. And then a Saturday morning in winter, a fairgrounds in snow, a car she recognized from a photograph her mother had kept in a box that Victoria had found at 16 and opened with the specific deliberateness of someone old enough to search and young enough to hope. It was the scratch she had known it by. In the photograph, which had been taken the summer before everything changed, her father was leaning against the car in the driveway of the house where Victoria had grown up, and she was beside him, 7 years old. And the scratch was visible in the photograph if you knew where to look, and Victoria had looked at that photograph so many times that she knew every centimeter of it, including the small crescent mark at the lower left corner of the front headlight housing. She had seen photographs of other 1963 Corvettes over the years, and none of them had that mark in that position. The mark was specific. It was the kind of specific that does not replicate by accident. She had not expected to find the car. She had not been looking for it that morning. She had come to the auction for other reasons, professional reasons, a transaction her acquisitions team had flagged as potentially useful. She had been moving through the rows on her way to the vehicle she had come to see when something, the specific red of the paint in the gray winter light, the particular geometry of the car had pulled her off course before she had consciously registered it. She had crouched by the headlight housing and looked at the scratch, and every calculation she had made about the morning had instantly become irrelevant. Jack retrieved the envelope from the compartment beneath the driver's seat. He had to reach past the seat hardware to get to it, and the act of reaching felt, to everyone watching, like a ceremony of some kind, the deliberate retrieval of a thing kept carefully over a long time, which is what it was. The envelope was yellowed at the edges but intact, the seal unbroken, the writing on the outside still legible in Robert's careful hand. For the person who appears at the right time. Victoria took it with both hands. She held it for a moment without opening it. The way you hold a thing that you have spent a long time looking for before you allow yourself to have it. The people standing nearby had, without organizing themselves or making any collective decision, arranged themselves into a loose circle, not pressing in but not retreating either, occupying the instinctive configuration of human beings who understand they are witnesses to something that deserves witnessing. Victoria opened the envelope. She removed 3 sheets of paper, folded in thirds in the way that letters from that era were always folded. The handwriting was the same as the envelope, careful and formal, the handwriting of a man who had been taught that written words deserved the dignity of being formed with intention. She read it privately for a moment before, with a glance at Jack. She began to read it aloud, not performing but simply sharing, the way you share a thing that is too large to carry alone. The letter was Robert Sinclair's explanation, 30 years late, written as though he had always known it would one day arrive at exactly the right hands through exactly the right path. He had left, he wrote, not because he did not love his family but because the alternative to leaving had been to bring his failure down on all of them, the financial ruin of a man who had chosen, when the moment of crisis came, to pay his workers rather than his creditors, a decision that had cost him everything he owned and left him, at 62, without the resources to rebuild and too proud to ask his family to share the rubble. He had left because he had believed, incorrectly, that absence was a form of protection. He had believed, incorrectly, that a man who could not provide had forfeited the right to be present. He had spent the years that followed in a kind of voluntary exile, making himself small, maintaining the few friendships he was still capable of, trying to repay in informal ways the debts he could not repay formally. He had met a young mechanic on the side of a road on a winter night, and he had recognized in that young man something that he had been trying to identify in himself for years: the willingness to help without calculating the return, the ease of generosity, not yet complicated by disappointment. And he had held that recognition close, because it was the closest he had come in a long time to the person he had once believed himself to be. He wrote about Victoria using her name, which she had not heard from him since she was 11 years old, and the specific detonation of hearing her own name in her dead father's handwriting read aloud, in the cold air of a winter fairground, was something that no one present would be able to adequately describe afterward, though many would try. He wrote that she had been the best part of his life, and that she deserved to know that, and that if she was reading this letter it was because the universe, which he had not entirely stopped believing in despite considerable evidence, had managed to arrange what he himself had not been brave enough to arrange. He wrote, "If you are reading this, it means forgiveness found its own way. I always believed it would. I am sorry it took this long." Victoria read those last 2 sentences aloud, and then she could not continue. Not because she had broken, but because there was nothing more to continue with. The letter was over, and she had arrived at the edge of it the way you arrive at the edge of a territory you have been traveling toward for a very long time, and the edge is both the end and the beginning. She pressed the pages against her chest and stood in the snow and cried without making any effort not to cry, because she had earned this, had spent 30 years earning this, and the earning was over now. Jack stood beside her, in a specific kind of silence, not the silence of someone who does not know what to do, but the silence of someone who knows that this is not a moment that requires doing anything. The crowd was also silent. the particular silence of people who have been moved beyond the conversational register, beyond the evaluation register, into something older and less organized. Gerald the auctioneer had his hand pressed flat against his chest in an unconscious gesture of sympathy. Patterson, the dealer, had drifted to the edge of the gathering and was looking at the ground with the expression of a man reassessing the relative importance of things. Two women who had come to the auction together with a shared interest in pre-war automobiles were holding each other's arms without having noticed they had done so. What came next was not decided in a single conversation but in several, spread over 2 weeks of phone calls and meetings, and the careful, quiet work of two people figuring out what the right thing was, not the transactionally correct thing, not the financially optimal thing, but the right thing, which is a different and harder calculation. Victoria had not given up the idea of acquiring the car, but the nature of the acquisition had changed completely. She was not buying a collectible. She was not completing a transaction. She was trying to honor a web of obligations, her father's to the people he had employed, hers to the memory she had been carrying, Jack's to the instruction in the letter, the instruction they had both now finally read: keep it until the person who needs it appears. What Victoria proposed, over the course of those 2 weeks, was this. The car would not be sold. It would be donated to a new institution, a vocational training center, funded jointly by Sinclair Technologies and a coalition of the business people who had been standing in that fairground and had understood, in the way that people sometimes understand things all at once, that they had been given an unusual opportunity. The center would carry the name of Robert Allen Sinclair, who had spent his life believing in the value of skilled work and had proven that belief by paying for it when it cost him everything. The Corvette would sit at the center of the facility's entrance hall, not behind glass, not roped off, but accessible, a thing that people could look at and touch and understand as an object that had a history. And on the wall beside it, framed and lit, would be the letter. Not a copy, the original. Robert's words in Robert's handwriting, made available to anyone who needed to read them. Jack had listened to this proposal across a diner table on a Thursday evening in late January, with his coffee going cold again, in the way that his coffee always seemed to go cold because he forgot to drink it when he was thinking, and he had thought about it for a long time in the way he thought about things, not rapidly but thoroughly. Turning it over, until he had seen every surface of it, he said, finally, that the car had never really been his. He had known that for 30 years, in the same way he had known who the letter was addressed to before he knew who the person was. He said that Robert had given him something much more valuable than the car, had given him a way of seeing the world and his place in it that had informed every good decision he had made in the 30 years since, and that the car had mostly been the vessel for that, the physical form of a relationship that was not, at its core, about an automobile. He said he thought Robert would have liked the proposal. Victoria looked at him across the table and said she thought so too. Outside the diner window, the winter was beginning to ease, not gone yet, but losing its edge, the first tentative negotiation between cold and warm that precedes the season's slow turn. The Robert Sinclair Vocational Training Center opened in the early fall of that year, in a renovated industrial building in Columbus that had been, in a previous life, a parts warehouse. A choice that felt apt to everyone who knew the story, which was, by then, a lot of people. The opening drew a crowd of several hundred, including people who had read about the fairground afternoon and felt the pull of a story that offered something increasingly rare: the resolution of a thing. Victoria spoke. Jack spoke briefly and without notes, in the precise and unhurried way of a man who does not use more words than a thing requires. Several of the business owners who had been present at the auction that Saturday and had subsequently pledged support spoke about what the project meant to them, and some of them were more eloquent than others, but all of them were sincere, which is the more important qualification. The Corvette stood in the entrance hall as promised, under a single warm overhead light that illuminated the riverside red. Paint the way that paint deserves to be illuminated. Not the artificial brilliance of a showroom spotlight, but the steadier, more honest light of a thing that has been somewhere and done something and is at rest now in a place that knows its value. Months became a year, and the year became years. The center trained hundreds of people in the skilled trades, that form the invisible infrastructure of the visible world: mechanics, electricians, machinists, people who make the things that make other things work. Jack became a regular presence there, not as a salaried instructor, but as the kind of person who shows up on Tuesday afternoons and stands beside someone who is struggling with a diagnostic problem and asks questions rather than giving answers, which is the more useful form of assistance. Victoria came when her schedule permitted, which was more often than her schedule suggested it should, and over time, the visits lost their formal quality and became simply the visits of a person who comes to a place because the place means something. She and Jack developed a friendship that had the slightly unlikely quality of all genuinely unlikely friendships. Two people who had no reason to know each other and every reason to keep knowing each other, held together not by proximity or habit, but by the specific gravity of a shared story. They talked about Robert sometimes, and about what he had been, and sometimes they talked about other things entirely. And both kinds of conversation had the same quality of ease, which is the quality that real friendships have once they have been tested and found to hold. On a morning in November, 2 years after the auction, Victoria drove to the center before it opened, let herself in with the key she had been given, and stood in the entrance hall with the Corvette in the early light that came through the east-facing windows, the kind of light that arrives before the day has fully decided what it wants to be, angled and golden, making every surface hold its own small warmth. She had been thinking about a decision her company faced, a significant one, the kind that would affect hundreds of people who worked for her and whose livelihoods were, in the specific way that livelihoods are always connected to the people who hold them in trust, her responsibility. She had come here not for an answer, but for a recalibration. The way you sometimes need to return to the place where you learned a thing in order to remember the thing clearly. Outside, the November air had the particular clarity of the season, cold enough to sharpen everything, not cold enough yet to make presence uncomfortable. The brief window of autumn that makes you aware of warmth as a thing worth protecting, rather than a condition you take for granted. Jack arrived 20 minutes after she did, having been called by the security guard who knew he would want to know. He walked in without ceremony, poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine near the office, and brought one to her without asking if she wanted it. They stood together in the early light and looked at the car in the easy silence of people who have been through something together and no longer need to fill the space between them with noise. The apprentices would arrive in an hour, a new cohort, 15 young men and women who had signed up for the 8-month program and who would spend their first morning being introduced to the building and the tools and the standards expected of people who work with their hands in a place that takes that work seriously. They came from different backgrounds and different starting points, and what they had in common was simply the willingness to show up, which Jack had always believed was the most underrated form of courage, to be present at the beginning of something before you know whether you will prove equal to it. Jack had prepared notes for the orientation, written by hand on index cards in the same careful block letters he used for everything, because he believed that the way you prepared for a thing was part of the thing itself. Victoria had read through a budget report on the drive over and left it in the car, because some mornings require you to put the numbers down and simply be where you are. The scratch was visible on the headlight housing, exactly as it had always been, small and old and specific, the mark of a particular moment in a particular life, left there not carelessly but simply without correction, because some marks are part of a thing's truth and ought to be kept. Students sometimes asked about it. Jack had developed, over time, a way of answering that question without telling the whole story, immediately letting the answer arrive in pieces over the course of a week or a month of knowing a person. Because a story given all at once is just information, whereas a story given gradually becomes something a person can grow into. Victoria wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the car for a long time. Then she said, almost to herself, that there were things worth more than money. Jack was quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way of people who do not fill silences with words they do not mean. Then he said, like a promise, kept all the way to the end. Victoria looked at him. The light moved across the floor as the sun cleared the building line outside. The Corvette stood in it, red and whole and particular, carrying its history the way well-made things carry history, not as a burden, but as a kind of depth, the accumulated meaning of decades of care and intention, and the stubborn, unremarkable, extraordinary work of people who decided to do right by each other and kept deciding, year after year, for as long as they had the years to do it in, some things are worth more than money. Not because money lacks power, but because there are forms of value that money was never designed to measure: the keeping of a word no one is watching you keep, the tending of a thing you were trusted with, the patience of waiting for the right moment rather than the convenient one. The car had waited. Jack had waited. And in the end, as Robert had believed it would, the right moment had arrived, exactly on time, wearing the face of a woman who had spent 30 years becoming someone her father would have been proud of, arriving at a fairground in the snow with every reason to stay closed and choosing, instead, to open,